Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 3, Heart of the Seer. Chapter 18, Vaer the Seer. The Inrathians readied their bows, spreading out into an open formation to avoid presenting the fire breathers with an easy target. Brune fingered the hilt of his blade. He wondered whether there would ever be an opportunity to use it against the monster that was Malik Julian. There were so many of these beasts. Evrain's men were hesitating. He could see them looking about uncertainly. What was the man doing? Did he not realize their only hope lay in pressing the enemy host hard, keeping as close as they could to the marshlanders? If a gap should open between the two forces, the beasts would be able to attack from the front, greatly reducing the effectiveness of the bowmen against them. "Push forward," he whispered under his breath. Even Raelf's men, already sensing the victory at their end, now lost their momentum, allowing the enemy to regroup and form ranks again. "Don't falter now!" Brune was shouting, motioning wildly for the men to advance. He grabbed the messenger by the arm. "Tell them to attack! Tell them to keep pushing forward!" The youth nodded, his eyes large. Then he was off at a sprint. Evrain fought desperately against the numbing fear that had engulfed him. His thoughts were a jumble of contradictions, warring against one another. It was impossible to face such fiends as these. Madness. There was no place to run. They were cut off from the city. He should press the attack, stay close to the enemy formation. That had been the plan, had it not? Still, they had no idea the creatures would be this many. The Amul warriors waved their spears on high, shouting and cheering as if they had already won the day. Those who were retreating rallied to form their lines again. The war drums picked up the faltering rhythm once more. The moment of crisis had arrived for the Vaeran, Garolain realized. They had to fall back without delay. He had to leave the men already engaged behind to make their own way back or fall where they stood. It was time to save what he could of the host or lose them all to Malik's beasts. Garolain gave the signal to retreat in haste. The trumpets took up the call, ringing high above the din. The 80 blades formed a thin skirmish line to cover the retreat. He wondered for a moment if they would have any impact against such overwhelming odds. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and the order he had hoped for disintegrated before his eyes. Men broke ranks haphazardly, their training forgotten, the beginning of panic in their eyes. He looked behind him to gauge the distance separating them from the war machines. If the host broke now, it would be a disaster. Only the archers kept up their end, tired though they were. At least the Amul counterattack would be met with some resistance, though these were forced to run for their lives as well. The formation of Lok'tiai had reached the height of the tower, slowly beating higher still. Each time their spiraling ascent brought them close to the city wall, Gareth felt the dread intensify, the physical sensation of paralyzing pain spreading through his body. Fear turned him away from the sight. His face wore a new expression of urgent purpose.
"Here we part. My hour has come at last."
Gareth felt the aching sadness unsettle his fear. His eyes begged for the outcome he knew could not be.
"What will you do?"
Fear did not answer, but simply drew the blade from its sheath. Above them, the sky had darkened even more, till the midday resembled a murky dusk.
"Stay concealed here in the watchtower. If they become aware of you, they will surely try to break you."
"Who are they?"
"My mother's priests, the Grey Cloaks of Lakeside."
Gareth thought desperately, searching for what he knew to be impossibilities, yet unwilling to yield to the truth.
"You cannot fight them all.
He blurted out finally.
There are too many. They are...
Farewell, Gareth.
A sad smile creased the marble features. A gloved hand touched the boy's cheek. Vaer stepped backwards and launched himself off the tower over the silent city. Gareth caught his breath and placed a hand over his mouth to stifle the cry of anguish he could not contain. The figure rose quickly into the murk above them. In a few moments the darkness had swallowed him. Gareth rushed back to the front rail, scanning the sky for the Lochtii. The group seemed to have dispersed, with 8 of the 13 beating eastwards after the retreating Vaeron of Gilreth. The others had a shorter flight to reach the Aran host. What would the men do to defend themselves against this terrible foe? Evrain was down there, and Hunnick, Rune. Forgetting the warning of the Seer, Gareth reached for the bow and bent it to fit the string. He knew the beasts were well out of range already, yet he could not stand there simply watching the slaughter that was to come. To his relief, Lund saw the flying beasts divide themselves to east and west. Perhaps they were still unaware of his tiny force creeping up from the south. Would they afford him the opportunity to strike at the great Tuer himself? Surely they would turn and come to the aid of their master if he was under attack. Yet it would take them a while before they could reach him. If he died in their furious revenge, it would be worth the pain and the darkness of death to lift the blade against the oppressor, the foul fiend who had multiplied their shame and suffering and exulted in their misery. He quickened his pace, urging the men forward. This would be their day, their chance to make a difference. For the freedom of their brethren in the Northland, and for the helpless ones hiding in towers, they would strike their blow if it took their lives in the process. The road left the bordering trees behind, entering the open fields before Belruth. In the distance he saw the tall walls of the fortress. In front of them, half a mile away, stood a wooden platform open to the sky. Instinct told him this was the place he had to reach, the lair of the Shadow Lord. But the rush to reach this place was halted abruptly, giving way to concern. Between his charging band and the Tuer Lord stood an army of many thousands, their familiar armored figures striking dread into the hearts of the former slaves. Here, at last, was the host of the Tuer themselves, as yet untouched by battle. Lund recognized the armor of the hunters, metal plate he had not been able to penetrate with a hooked claw in the running trails of Grail. Here stood hundreds and hundreds of the hated men. Cycles of ingrained fear and conditioning convinced him that striving against such as these was futile. He had to bring back by force the memories of the ghost cave under Grail, the flaming vengeance of the blade, the huge hulk of Groth lying motionless on the roaning floor. They could be beaten. He had seen this. On his platform, Malik the Undying received his first surprise of the day. A column of unfamiliar soldiers had appeared on the Tew Road. Where were the ravens? Why had they not alerted him? He strained to make out the dress, the weapons they carried, the shape of the shields, the small stature. Vaedrin.
Czar,
His voice snapped at the figures huddling under the structure.
my lord,
The leading grey cloak dropped back his hood.
the Southern Road. Who are they? Vaedrin?
Czar grew pensive for a few moments, then looked back at him with a puzzled expression.
Not Vaedrin, my lord. Viron. The reek of Grail in the south. These are slaves from the Dankwood. Nonsense. That is impossible. Ready the host to meet them. And make it quick. It is almost time for the final phase.
Slaves? The old man had undoubtedly lost his senses. But if they were indeed Viron, there could be a few dangerous warriors among them. How fitting, he thought. Here the ancient adversaries would meet like they had not for cycles without count. Quickly he scanned the column, now spreading out to both sides of the road to form a line of battle. They did not even number 1,500, perhaps only 1,000. His own Tuer force numbered 10,000. This would be a spectacle to enjoy, a pleasant diversion before the last act of his grand scheme. A breeze stirred in the west, pressing in banks of heavy cloud and merged with the multitudes already converged over Belruth. The deep rumbling of thunder started up among them, drowning the terrible din of drum, voice, and arms proceeding from the striving hordes. The heavens were crawling with webs of light, though none of it yet touched the ground. Below the watchtower, the fields were lit up intermittently by this threatening display. Gareth's gaze was drawn to the east, where the brilliant blazes of color had started up again. He knew this was a desperate effort, for the men from Gilreth were beating a hasty and disorderly retreat. To the west, Aaron seemed to be on the attack still, the commanders screaming at their men to be heard above the tumultuous noise. 5 dragons, wing to wing, soared over the marshland host. They would circle to the rear to clear their line of attack, he realized. Somewhere in the writhing whirlpool above them was Vaer. Gareth hugged the bow to himself, straining his eyes to pierce the gloom. There, on the edge of the swirling clouds, hovered a small figure, blade in hand. He heard the cry without the sound of it reaching him.
Merlothin.
The blade leaped into white fire, seemingly at one with the elements at play all around. Like the lightning he fell, so swift the lumbering forms below had no warning of his coming. Gareth held his breath as the figure sliced through the flying formation. The beast in the center bellowed in rage and shock when the blade sheared off its right wing at the shoulder. It plummeted downwards immediately, flapping uselessly with the remaining one. Slamming into the ground, its great bulk crushed a dozen marshlanders who could not escape in time. The other creatures veered off direction, scattering to left and right. They craned their long necks to peer about them for a sign of this fleet attacker, calling to one another in braying, rage-filled tones. There could be no attempt to strike at the Aaron host, while they were forced to defend themselves from an enemy they could not perceive. Vaer used the speed of his dive to gain height once more. If he could reach the cloud bank above, the monsters would have little warning of his next attack. Just before he was enveloped by the dark, wispy sea, one of the beasts caught sight of his fleeting form. A quick bark warned the others. 3 turned back, lumbering upwards towards him. 1 continued towards the right wing of the Aaronite force. Vaer watched it approach. His bowmen were ready, spread out in open formation, their arrows pointed at the sky. Sparks started everywhere as the braziers were lit. He fitted the arrow with care, the shaft sleek and straight against the leather brace on his wrist. Quickly, he dipped the rag round its tip into the flames. The beast was rather low, having lost altitude after the evasive maneuver. It turned sideways to circle behind Earl Wayne's hard-pressed flank, exposing its belly to the archers. Yes! Streaks of fire rose up from the field, spreading towards the beast. Within moments the men had whipped more arrows into place, carefully dipping them into the fires. The beast screamed in rage but did not alter its course. Several little lights rode on its wings, though none appeared to have penetrated the body. Another flight bounded before it could level out behind the Aaronite spears. Vaer shouted a futile warning, but there was little to be done. An inferno of flame reached down from the horror, engulfing the field, the shrubs, the men below. He could only watch as the soldiers rushed about, crumpling to their knees, screaming. Even the advancing marshlanders were given pause. Some of their number also caught in the area of impact. He gritted his teeth, snarling at his men to ready themselves. The monster's flight seemed unimpaired. They had to concentrate their arrows on the wings. Seer stirred his wings back and forth to maintain his position just inside the murky bank. He watched the 3 make their way towards him, watched them ready themselves to spew forth their deadly billows. Waited till the last moment. As soon as the wall of flame rolled out from their gaping walls, he propelled himself upwards and to the side, rising clear in 2 wing beats. He banked swiftly and broke through the haze directly above them. Again he targeted the center creature, landing on its back, and drove the blade through its armored hide in a crackling thrust. There was barely time to free it and leap clear. The stricken beast rolled over in the air, clawing the space where he had been. He closed in for the kill, aware of the snapping jaws of another close by. The throat was exposed. His blade found it in a sizzling sweep, almost severing the head entirely. He rolled away, diving swiftly to evade its snarling fellows. Evrain saw the bulk of the dragon smash into the ground among the enemy. Its missing wing made it impossible to remain airborne, but it was far from finished. The fiend lashed out at anything within reach, belching out its storm of fire in a wide sweep. He ordered his men back out of range. It would be madness to press an enemy already being incinerated by this monster of their own making. The plan would have to change. Quickly, he sent a messenger to Hunnic in the rear. The Inrathians would have to deal with it. The Marsland warriors retreated also, and a wide, empty circle opened between the two front lines. Now there was an exchange of arrows only, many slamming into the armored beast without apparent effect. Hunnic came up with his column in tow. Evrain nervously scanned the skies for more of the beasts. One had engaged the right flank. He could see the hundreds of fire arrows rising up to meet it.
Forget the arrows.
Hunnic growled.
They do nothing to it.
What can you do?
He shrugged.
You have to get in close. We need someone to distract it. I don't know if I can penetrate that armor.
He looked about.
There is room.
Evrain shrugged.
With the left flank.
Hunnic turned to the messenger who had brought him there.
Fetch him.
As the man scurried off to obey, a great plume of flame appeared to the right of them, behind Earl Wayne's line of battle.
Imran's breath!
Evrain stared in shock.
That was right over the men!
Garrelain knew things were going badly, even before he saw the first stab of fire from the beasts overhead. There was no more attempt to command the running men, only the mad rush to gain the line of defense. Men were dropping shields, even spears, striving to stay ahead of the charging Amul, the fiery threat above. For many, it was a futile effort. The retreat was turning into a rout. Ahead loomed the huge war machines that served as decoys. One had actually been readied by its mock crew, loaded with its only missile. Though it was impossible to say why, the sight of it was encouraging. He halted behind, breathing heavily. Several sergeants gathered round him, and Garrelain realized that the men were not all fleeing in panic.
Stop the archers!
He managed to gasp.
One volley! From here!
The men understood. This had to appear to be their last line of defense. Quickly they called out to the running men all around, spreading out their arms to gather them into formation. Garrelain almost regretted the decision. Perhaps half his archers formed a ragged line behind the engines. With supreme effort they raised their bows, waiting for the command. It was difficult to see where the biggest concentration of enemies were. Streaks of light in the field behind showed him where the blade sentry still contested with the Amul warriors. The indecision caused a delay they could ill afford. The ragged volley finally sped off towards the advancing enemy. At the same moment, 3 fire-breathers dived for the line of war machines. The single prepared engine launched a length of ball and chain towards a column of warriors, bulging ahead of the rest. There was no opportunity to see the result of this improvised shot. Flames engulfed the wooden structures, catching some of the crew who lingered too long. The line of archers broke, scattering to avoid a similar fate. Garrelain continued his mad flight towards Hein's Rise.
Ready the archers!
Lund felt the calm of the crypts descend upon him. Even if the tour outnumbered them 10 to 1, he would make sure they could not aid their fellows engaged in the raging battles to east and west. This would be a worthy distraction, occupying such an intimidating force and preventing them from aiding the other formations. The tour were deploying into a line of battle. Their archers were armed with the heavy crossbows he had seen the hunters use. He glanced behind him quickly. The colorful line of shields stood ready with the picked blades and scouts in front. Brith looked at him nervously, the axe blow still fresh in his memory.
Give them a volley.
The youth turned and stepped back through the shield line. Moments later, at his signal, a flight of arrows passed overhead. Though his archers were certainly inexperienced, individual marksmanship counted for little in the pack formations of the battlefield. The missiles strafed the marching tour soldiers, bringing down 20 or more and forcing them to lift their shields in haste. Lund smiled at the sight. What power these poor slaves now possessed to strike at a whole army of tour hunters, to bring low their mighty warriors even from a distance. Yet, far from being intimidated by the barrage, the enemy soldiers simply hastened their preparations, appearing little more than annoyed. Lund allowed more volleys to fall on them. After the third round, however, the enemy archers loosed their shafts in turn. A deadly rain descended on the Viran, who cowered behind shields, having no tradition or inclination of battlefield decorum. This action, though simply prudent on their part, brought a loud jeer from the Tuer ranks, who interpreted it as cowardice. Still, far fewer Viran were touched by the shafts than those falling under the descending arrows on the opposite side. Rune felt the slow turning of fate, bringing him ever nearer to that moment of dreaded confrontation with the fearsome creature he had first seen in the Dankwood. That nightmare of its armored potency, its otherworldly malice and unassailable power, a calculating predatory threat embodied in this hideous frame. All combined to undo the greatest resolve, and rob a warrior of what skill and boldness he possessed. As soon as the messenger from Hunnic found him, he knew that this hour of destiny had finally arrived. His body felt light as he followed the man in haste, as if he was walking on air. Where he headed now, the experiences of his troubled life could no longer aid him. Hunnic's men formed a semicircle in front of the main body, their shields lifted high to deflect the odd enemy missile. The grounded beast, some 50 yards away, glared in all directions, swiveling its head about. How much fire it still possessed, nobody could guess. Scores of arrows had struck its armored body, but only the remaining wings showed any evidence that it could be affected by such missiles. Hunnic's face was grim.
We will have to get in close. The blades are our only hope now.
Rune nodded nervously, his stomach turning into a tight knot of trepidation. The blade seemed strangely heavy in his hand.
I've picked 10 men to close in on it from our side. We will spread out to distract it, taking the opportunity should it come.
Hunnic continued. Wait. There was the flicker of a smile.
I may as well see if that thing can resist me. You are here to make sure of its destruction.
The sharp command summoned the chosen few who spread out in a semicircle, crouching low behind their shields. 10 yards separated each man from his companions, making it difficult for the monster to target more than one effectively. The 2 remaining beasts attacked with all the fury and force they could muster. At the sight of their headless fellow falling to the ground below, they let out bellows of vengeful rage, straining upwards to gain the advantage of height. Yet the massed clouds above blinded them as soon as they entered the swirling mist, and their fleet adversaries slipped away into the murk once more. Only now did their foe turn to their master, almost shamefully, requesting his aid. Alec Julian shuddered with pleasure and anticipation. The hated Seer had made his appearance. Things were to be much easier than he had surmised at first. There would be no lengthy siege of the towers, no mountain fastness to subdue inch by inch against the power of this potent master of the art. The fool had come to the aid of his doomed race, to share their miserable fate. He turned to the leader of his battle priests.
Czar, deal with these pathetic slaves.
The old Tuer turned away to obey, taking the remainder of the priests with him. The master's call went after the scattered Loctii, summoning those he needed to close the trap round the Seer. Vaer closed in on his prey from behind. The blade shimmered in his hand, heavy with hemmed power. Only at the last moment did they become aware of the threat. The beast sheared away sharply, but not before he had severed the tail of the closest one. The stricken fiend was thrown off balance, and unable to maneuver efficiently, lost altitude. Its companion dived with it, taking care not to become separated. As soon as they dropped below the clouds, the Loctii turned to head back in the direction of the platform, fleeing the swift menace they could not overcome by themselves. Gareth saw them reappear over the city and feared for a moment that Fear had been struck down. Moments later, the telltale streak of light stabbed down from the rolling clouds as the Seer descended on the slower monster. The scream was deafening, near yards away from the watchtower, and Gareth dropped the bow involuntarily to cover his ears. As the lifeless body fell down into the burnt village below, Fear pushed away again, heading for the cloud cover. His movements appeared a little sluggish now, the wings working harder than before to speed him along. The boy watched him in awed silence, his hands slowly dropping to his sides again. Garrelane could see the sloping ground of the rise just ahead, but he knew already that he would not make it to the hidden line of defense higher up among the trees. His breath was coming in short gasps, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. The men of Gilrith were scattered all around him, running, limping, even crawling away from the pursuing fiends that struck at them from above, snatching individuals, smashing through groups, or scorching any concentration of bodies with fire. They were cunning, he realized even through his hopeless fatigue, holding back their power till it could be used to best advantage. Targeting those men who attempted to form lines of defense prevented any concerted effort to halt the chaotic flight. Were there even any of his men still resisting the Amal warriors? He could not be sure. Boulders framed with shrub and low trees dotted the rise. Piles of grey stone rose from the tall grass here and there. If he could only escape their attention long enough to gain one of these havens. From the corner of his eye, he saw one of the larger beasts bank and turn towards him. A few more steps. It was a nightmare coming true. All the sluggish fear and overwhelming inevitability closed in on him with the wing beats of the monster. He reached the stone pile, in the center of which a tall broken pillar pointed skyward. Garrelane pressed his back to the rough stone, his chest heaving, and brought up the blade to his chest. The beast was seemingly making directly for him. Had it singled him out, he would put what remained of his strength into the final blow. The winged horror craned its neck as it descended eagerly, as if it relished his growing fear. The fingers round the hilt of his blade were suddenly clumsy. It was close enough now to make out the malicious red gleam in its eyes, the rippling power of its bulk. He drew a last breath. As if summoned by an inaudible trumpet call, 6 of the beasts abruptly turned away from the pursuit, winging their way back westwards from whence they had come. The large one was among them, passing so close over the rocks where Garrelane paddled that he felt the wind from its beating wings wash over him. The apparent urgency of its departure convinced him that there had indeed been a signal of some kind. 5 more followed in its wake. He let out his breath and lowered his shaking hand, watching them. This escape was miraculous. Still, there were 2 more of the monsters slaughtering the fleeing Viron on the field. If only his weary men could make it further up the slope. A tiny note, inaudible in the violent din, emanated from the great blade, and Rune could feel the warmth of it through his glove, spreading up his arm, as if in encouragement. Perhaps there were memories in the chrysolite, of times past, of the deeds of former masters, from Fenwith the first slayer of dragons, through the long heroic cycles till now. He grasped at once the tremendous honor bestowed, that he would be singled out and chosen by such a weapon. There had to be something inside him, a quality to match this favor. The Inrathians shouted war cries as they closed in on the beast in a swift rush. Nevertheless, they took care not to bunch together, allowing it to focus on any particular target. Hunnick was a fraction ahead of the rest, having chosen the opposite side from Rune's attack. His blade would certainly draw the beast's gaze away from their champion. Already he could see the red eyes settling on him, the bulging frame readying itself to belch forth its stream of bright death. He reached back, the tremendous pressing of potential in the stormy sky easy to find. Planting his feet firmly to support himself, he struck with force, bringing his free hand to the hilt also. The target was lined up in front of him, impossible to miss. The ground heaved, shuddering under the pressing pulse. A scream of rage and pain erupted from the creature, but it did not fall. Smoke came off its hide in billows, and it staggered, lurching forward towards him. The fire, when it came, was less intense than before, as if the hurt had touched its ability to conjure flames. Hunnick had no time to dodge, despite the urgent calls of alarm from his fellows. The fire rolled over him, almost softly, without the impact of a blow, withering what remained of the scorched grass about him. In what he believed were his final moments, there was no thought of failure or futility, even though his blow had not killed it. Rune would get his opportunity now that the beast was distracted. Behind the armored abomination came a warrior, his tall blade ablaze with amber light. The shouting fellows of the stricken man were given pause, and even the dull fiend became aware of its peril. It turned its hideous head, the fire fading from its open mouth. Rune halted 10 paces away, regarding it steadily. All doubt had evaporated. He was the lodestone, he knew this. The very blood in his veins, the life that pulsed through his frame, with command power sufficient to enforce the subjection of this monster. He struck, and the beast had no time to draw breath for its death rattle. Irathians behind it scurried away in haste to avoid being caught in the path of the searing stroke that reached well beyond the carcass of the creature. Even as he delivered it, Rune knew the blow had been too powerful. The strength seeped from his arms, his shoulders, and the breath from his lungs. He gasped in sudden pain, dropping to a knee, his vision blurring. For a few moments all he saw was the scorched soil 2 feet from his face. Yet the weakness passed as suddenly, leaving him feeling only slight discomfort. He looked up as a figure strode over to him. It was Hunnick, the outline of his body shimmering still, the blade in his hand alight with 7 symbols forming a forgotten arcane word. The man that should have been consumed by the dragon's fire reached out a hand to him. He grasped it and was pulled to his feet.
We cannot linger here, much as I would like to celebrate.
Hunnick remarked, his voice betraying some of the wonderment he felt at being alive still. He motioned in the direction of the awed enemy ranks forming up again for the attack.
Let's leave this to Evrain and go assist Bior.
Rune regarded him strangely. The fire! I thought... Hunnick shook his head, smiling, even as he pulled the man after him towards their lines.
No, I thought it too, but there was protection when I needed it. Thank the stars for that son of yours.
Brith sensed the hesitation among his fellows at the sight of such a formidable foe as faced him now. The tour host had formed up, ignoring the hail of Viron arrows, in ranks 10 deep, and a formation twice as long as their own pitiful line. How were they to overcome an army of hunters? Next to him, Lund prepared himself for the charge. The champion would hurl himself at the enemy formation, even if he had to go by himself. It would not be possible to dissuade him. An overwhelming heaviness of dread and foreboding stole over Brith. He reminded himself over and over that they had faced the fire-breather of Grail, and had prevailed. Yet voices of doubt argued that the monster had been overcome with guile and not force. The dark wall of steel in front of them would not be tricked into submission.
What do you intend?
His urgent whisper turned the head of his eager companion. Lund's eyes already betrayed a trace of battle madness.
We will keep these warriors out of the main battle, and if I can break through them, the Great Doer is my target.
He motioned in the direction of the figure on the platform. Brith shuddered visibly.
Do you think you can break through that?
He did not need to point to the enemy formation.
These two have not faced the power of our blades. It may be that we can catch them off guard.
A light of purpose blazed in the young Viron's eyes, a determination and assurance Brithael knew most of their supposed host lacked. He hated to be the voice of caution.
If you charge that line now, most of these boys will not follow you.
Lund frowned and looked about him. His soldiers were hiding behind their Vaedran shields, peeping out from time to time as the enemy volleys descended upon them in waves. Only the black surcoats of his scouts, emblazoned with the amber eye, stood tall and apparently unafraid. He pointed to these.
Perhaps I will only need them to break through.
You will be cut off. If we are to occupy them here, we cannot lose you.
Some part of his whirling mind convinced Lund that this was true. Reluctantly, he reconsidered his plan. Should he wait for the tour to attack? Every moment that passed could help his allies gain the victory elsewhere on the field. Would his force stand up to a charge by the vastly superior enemy? He had awakened that morning almost certain that this would be his dying day. He could never have dreamed up a better ending for his life than to withstand the hated enemy on a field of battle. All that remained was to ensure that he made use of this opportunity to the utmost, to injure them in the greatest way possible.
We'll form the line as we were taught.
Brith sighed in secret relief. The two were in position to begin their assault, yet they seemed to be in no hurry. It was clear that they regarded the appearance of the Viron force as little more than a nuisance. Still, the threat could not be ignored. a considerable number of them had already succumbed to the deadly barrage of arrows. The order for the advance was given. The long, dark line of armor and spear moved forward. Almost simultaneously, the enemy crossbows ceased their volleys, allowing the Vaeron line to reform. The flanks of the long line hurried ahead of the center, since there was no one to oppose them. Brith looked on with concern.
If they get behind us, we will not be able to withdraw.
The words had hardly left his mouth when a crackling surge reached over the advancing line like a giant hand, striking at the center of the Vaeron formation. There was a sickening answer from the clouds above, drawing violent fire down to the place of impact in a resounding crash, deafening all those in close proximity for a moment. 3 soldiers in the front were killed instantly. A dozen more were flung about like rag dolls. The strange smell rose from the smoking ground where the bolt had touched the soil. There was no time to react to this brutal display, for another blow was struck, closer to where they stood among the little band of scouts. The wild energy fell among those carrying blades and was met with much greater resistance. Brannick saw the blazing finger touch those directly before him. Leogarth was knocked clean off his feet, the armor from the Septalion blazing brightly. A wild chorus rang out from the protesting blade as it spun away from him. Brithael regarded him in shock, realizing what was taking place. He turned to Lund in dismay.
What do? We have nothing to fight their priests.
Lund remembered the temple in Grail, the grey cloak with his dwarf-like companion, the fiery torture. Anger stirred in him.
We have to strike at them.
He murmured.
Can you see where they are?
Brithael craned his neck, but the relentlessly advancing enemy formation obscured his view.
No.
He hesitated.
They are beyond our reach.
Lund gripped his arm.
Take the archers back a bit, then lead them round the flank. Perhaps they could see them if you approach from the side. We will close with the enemy. They will hurt their own as well if the lines are close together.
The Tuor priest struck again, even as he said these words.
Hurry!
He shoved the reluctant Brith back towards the rear and lifted his blade to the sky.
Forward!
There was no answering shout from the former slaves, no battle cry to embolden themselves and dismay their enemies. In determined silence they stepped out to meet their oppressors. Bjorn gnashed his teeth as he watched the fire breather make another leisurely turn above his archers. The monster seemed to ignore the barrage of arrows aimed at it, and content itself with systematically destroying Earl Wayne's command. Perhaps 200 arrows had pierced the massive wings. What would it take to bring the beast down? As he looked on, the monster overbalanced and had to correct itself. It appeared sluggish suddenly, the first sign that the barrage was having any effect. When it finally managed to level out, there was no renewed attack, but rather a clumsy attempt at gaining altitude in order to pass over the host in the direction from which it had come. Hope surged through every onlooker. The Aaronites made an effort to regain their formation, convinced that the nightmare assault was over. The stir close by brought Bior's attention back to the ground. Several men came rushing towards him, among them Hannik and Rune.
You've got him now.
The former shouted as they came up to him breathlessly. It's not down yet, he replied. They watched with satisfaction as it struggled vainly to rise higher, striving with frenzied effort on wings that could no longer support its weight. Hannik touched Rune's arm.
We should strike it as soon as it touches the ground. Don't give it opportunity to get its bearings.
Rune nodded in reply, and the two sped off again, following in the monster's wake. The marshland forces, though clearly gaining the advantage over the disrupted Aaronite right wing, held back while the fire-breather was wreaking its havoc. It was gratifying to see the armored ranks of Aaron broken and dismayed, unable to remain in their lethal formations or employ their effective tactics. Now that the dragon was beating a retreat, they were ready to renew the assault. Still they lingered in alarm as the creature lost altitude. It no longer seemed to be able to control its descent, and could possibly smash into their advance if they were too eager. Their intuition proved all too accurate. 30 yards short of the leading warriors, the foul beast, its wings smoldering and torn, plowed into Wayne's men, who scattered in all directions to avoid the crashing bulk. Several were crushed under it, the rest fled for their lives. The bellows of pain and anger from the wounded creature were enough to scatter any thought of resistance from anyone in its proximity. Though disoriented and partially stunned, the monster could still move with astonishing speed. Hunnick closed in on it from the front, brandishing his blade to attract its attention. Instead of enveloping the rushing warrior in a shroud of flame, the dragon moved forward to close the distance between them. Rune saw the outcome of this maneuver before its consummation and realized offhand the danger Hunnick was in. The Vaeron would not be able to avoid the creature's physical attack and would certainly be caught by its sweeping claws. He attacked without preparation, striking with what he had in reserve. It was hardly enough to make an impact on the creature, but sufficient to distract it from its victim. In that instant, Rune realized the reach of his weapon was limited, and its potency diminished rapidly the further away the target. He would need to be in close quarters for greater effectiveness. The beast turned its massive head in his direction, and he felt that momentary paralyzation of its malevolent glare. Almost too late he fought free of it. The spiked tail was already lashing round to catch him from behind. His body moved with the speed of the arena as he lunged to his left and rolled away, to find the armored tail sweeping inches above his frame. Hunnick, more cautious now, used his art in a powerful strike against the beast. Again, there was no physical sign of injury, but the reaction testified that it had been hurt, for the creature turned back to him in a fury, ready to renew its initial attack. Apparently, it had exhausted its potential for belching forth flames, since it pursued its prey now with physical means exclusively. Rune darted closer for the killing thrust. The certainty that such abominations ought not to exist in that world, that all nature protested the appearance of such abhorrences on its shores, fueled his resolve. It was more difficult to control the power in his strike than to summon a sufficient amount. For an instant he could see the wrath pulsing from his blade to smite the monster in an overwhelming flood. Sparks showered from the scaled bulk. The horned head was engulfed in fierce flame. Again, the weakness and fatigue possessed him momentarily, though this time he felt its lingering effects more acutely. Somewhere in the back of his mind rang the warning of the Seer.
Do not waste your power on other opponents, not even the fire breathers. You will need all the strength you have to strike the death blow.
Yet what was he to do? Who else could overcome these nightmare beasts? The dragon twisted and turned this way and that, straining its huge frame to the utmost. The beating of the great wings throbbed above the tumultuous battling crowds below. It was making its way back to its master with all haste, Fear realized. He would not let it escape to join its fellows. This time the beast was prepared for the sudden assault. As he descended upon its back, it rolled over, exposing its underside, but allowing at the same time an attack from the powerful hind legs and tail. Vaer could not avoid it altogether, and he was struck a glancing blow on his left side, a great claw raking the armor over his chest. Nevertheless, his burning blade tore a gash in the side of the creature, drawing blood. A stream of flame welled after him as soon as the beast regained its orientation. He had already twisted away and worked his way to a higher level once more. A quick glance towards the platform and its sinister occupant confirmed his suspicions. They were under 300 yards away from it. Oren had certainly recalled the other creatures already to come to the aid of this wretch. Though it was aware of him now and faced him head-on, there was no alternative but to attack at once. Huon moved in his hand, eager to annihilate what should never have been. The darkness and corruption before him. The Seer sighed in anticipation, felt for the wild surge of air, and dropped into a swift dive. The fire from the creature followed him, always a few feet behind as he rolled and angled his descent to close in on the quarry. At last the dragon rose up its tall frame to allow its tail and hind legs an opportunity to strike at the approaching enemy. Vaer did not hesitate. The swiftness of his darting descent carried him within reach of the armored body. He struck at the throat, above which oily smoke still poured from the creature's nostrils. Heavy claws tore through the air to cut him off, to deflect the lethal sting he carried, to tear his body into shreds and crush the life out of him. He was barely quick enough to avoid a serious injury. It writhed momentarily, the body no longer receiving instruction from the animal brain. Then the wings folded suddenly, and it plummeted to the ground below. From the tower, Gareth watched it fall with relief as well as growing concern. The Seer was clearly fatigued, perhaps wounded, and there was no opportunity for him to rest. The eastern sky, glimmering with crawling light, already held the shapes of the destroyers returning from their savagery over the Gilrith host. 6 monstrous forms, eager in their unmasked violence, rode in swiftly to close with this potent threat for which they had been recalled. A quick glance about the battlefield confirmed the havoc these creatures had caused among the ranks of the Aaronites also. The right wing of the host was disintegrating, and the center barely held its own against the ferocious renewed onslaught. Only close to the Belruth wall did the marshlanders seem to flounder, yet the Aaronites could not exploit this advantage for fear of becoming separated from the main body. Streaks of angry light to the south drew his gaze to where a new struggle was developing. He recognized the shields and stature at once. It was Lund's group, insanely attacking the tour host from that direction. The dark ranks of Malik's main force bore down on them like the incoming tide, while the priests of Lakeside battered the shield wall with unnatural force. He could hardly bear to watch. Down there among the brave souls confronting these brutes were Brennick and Rin, and many others of their age, to strive against the trained might of Thorallan. They would be overwhelmed, their heroic attack come to nothing. Gareth gripped the bow with one hand and reached for the arrows behind his right shoulder. It was no use, he knew this. The unequal struggle was far beyond his reach, and yet he had to aid them somehow, if he could cause a distraction of some kind. A warning flashed in his mind not to attack the priests, not to attempt breaking them as Cale had done with so little effort in the Portal Vale. There were so many of them here, and he had no experience in such contests. Had not Vaer told him to remain here unobserved? He could not remain watching and do nothing about it. Frantically, he searched for something to do. His eyes fell on the figure of the Swamp Lord on his improvised watchtower. The wood of the platform. He could feel its subtle invitation, its anticipation of the spark. Yet perched on top, like an oversized bruise in his mind, unreachable, venomous, stood the shadow, resisting with insurmountable power any attempt to overthrow him. Not even with the desperation he felt could Gareth touch such a horrible force. If only he could forget the abomination and find the wood. He dropped the bow and grasped the wooden rail in front of him. Slowly he forced all other images from his thoughts. The air was wild with crowding fire, the fuel, the tempting cries. He ignored the fear, the danger of exposure, and glaring at the structure below, drew the spark from the sky. There were shouts from among the trees, further up the slope, shouts of encouragement from the onlookers who were supposed to lie there in ambush. Fools, thought Garalane, as he caught sight of an exposed body here and there. How would they surprise the beasts if they showed themselves so openly? He looked back nervously at the gliding monsters, still strafing running men at will. They appeared supremely confident, untouchable, picking their targets at leisure, and flying so low their wingtips sometimes almost touched the ground. Perhaps it mattered little whether they spotted more men hidden among the trees. This sighting could even encourage them to attack head-on, since there was no resistance to their power. He soon realized that this was indeed the aim of the waving, gesticulating soldiers. By presenting the creatures with a more enticing target in the form of a compact, unbroken line, instead of the spread-out runners, they were sure to lure them into an attack. These actions smacked of Byran's cunning. He had not gained the line when he saw the fruits of the stratagem. Both dragons swept up the slope at the treetop level, preparing themselves for an outpouring of scorching death. The brave men lingered till the last moment before scattering or diving for cover. The hidden ballistae, camouflaged under branches, spewed forth their barbed bolts, catching both beasts at point-blank range. At first it seemed as if nothing had happened. The flames swept over the war machines, whose operators wore protective armor, setting one of them alight and burning the underbrush to stubble. Trees were engulfed instantaneously, blazing like torches in a sudden breeze. Then, as they attempted to bank and circle back, both creatures were brought up short by the ties attached to the bulbous. One actually halted in mid-air, though trees snapped in its wake, for a sufficient number of the stout anchors held to arrest its progress. It fell backwards, flapping ineffectually, unable to support its massive body in the air. The other was at a better angle to maintain its forward motion, but fared even worse. The hooks ripped from its right wing, while those in the left tore most of the anchors free from the ground. Immediate disparity threw it off balance, and it smashed sideways into a copse of tall trees, bringing down several in the process. So violent was the fall of these monsters that Vaer's men hesitated at the sight. Both creatures were stunned, but would recover soon enough to renew the fight. The archers soon covered them in showers of arrows, which served little purpose apart from distracting them, since none of the missiles penetrated the armored bodies. Vaer hastily ordered the Slayer squads forward. There were 3 groups, one to match each of the war engines. The men charged in, slowed somewhat by their heavy armor, surrounding the beasts to attack from all possible angles. Shafts of light reached forward from their weapons as they closed in. The dragons struggled against the ties, one of them ripping free. If they could take to the air again, they would escape the perilous situation they were in. This realization spurred the Vaer attacking them into fierce action. Both beasts were confused by the number and intensity of the attacks, yet their well-protected bodies resisted most of these. Only with persistence and much effort did they finally succumb, and not before the one that had broken free of the restraints had crushed 3 of the blade-wielding enemies who had ventured too close. There was no time to celebrate this victory. Vaer wheeled his archers about to face the Amul assault, devouring what remained of his retreating force. The Southanders were fleet of foot and lightly armored, making them more mobile than their Vaer opponents. Yet now that the irresistible Loctii had ceased their pursuit, pockets of Vaer halted their mad flight and turned about to resist. Count Vaer agonized over the best course of action. Should he send his force down to aid them? His blades were encumbered by heavy armor. Should he order them to shed it? What if the beasts returned? Already some of the retreating men were joining his command, but they were exhausted and disorganized. To his great relief and joy, he spotted a familiar figure among them.
Geraldine, thank the stars. I'd almost given you up.
They clasped hands briefly. Geraldine still struggled to catch his breath, and his shoulders stooped in fatigue. Together they stared in dismay over the field before them, where isolated Vaer were struggling to stay ahead of their pursuers and gain the defensive line. Vaer's face was as pale as that of his son.
Gods of Milo, our host is destroyed.
No. See there?
Geraldine pointed to the bottom of Hein's Rise, where a thin line was forming as more and more soldiers turned to fight.
We have to move downhill and stop the enemy advance there.
He passed his tongue over dry lips.
If you have a mouthful of water to spare, I will lead whoever we have available down there immediately.
The tour host closed in around Lund's band like a huge gloved hand, outflanking it on both sides. They moved with speed now, the race of hunters, with rage twisting what features could be discerned under helms and steel caps. Lund felt their hate beating about him, a familiar song of violent intent, and he gave himself to the madness, wading into the front ranks of the enemy. Somewhere in the turmoil of his thoughts remained a steady purpose, and he struck without anger, calculated and controlled, preserving his power. Even so, the blade sliced through armor and limb alike, soon leaving him alone in an empty space, populated only by fallen enemies. Breaking through the elation of battle came an odd pressure, invading mind and limiting perception. A familiar sick fear washed over him. The point of his blade dipped towards the ground. His free hand went unnoticed to his temple. He saw enemies closing in once more, but his body was strangely reluctant to react to this threat. The vile witches of Non-Meric had singled him out. Rennick watched the indolence grip his friend. He called out a warning that went unheeded. In desperation, he pushed away the heavy-armored enemy before him and entered the small clearing round Lund. Others followed, surrounding the silent form who had lowered his head and covered his face with a hand.
Defend him!
He screamed at the others and prepared himself for the enemy rush. A crossbow bolt whistled past him and struck the inert youth in the chest. The chrysolite composition became momentarily visible at the point of impact, crackling as the missile glanced off it. Lund took a step backwards and turned vacant eyes on his friends. All around, the enemy surged in, eager to bring them low. Brennick struck with desperate force, feeling the strength seep from his arms with each blow. A sword scraped across his back. The spearhead slammed into his ribs. The blade was alive with letters like that of Leogard. Fear was his enemy now, the next blow threatening to undo his resolve and open the way for a truer blade to find him. Already he felt the construct weakening, dissolving. He was down on his knee. A massive stroke had brought him down, vividly reviving the panic he had felt in the feeding pit so long before. There was time enough only to look up at the man before him, raising his heavy sword with 2 hands for the death blow. Fire erupted from the platform, under the very feet of the Shadow Lord. In an instant the wooden structure was ablaze, with flames leaping several feet into the air. Horan Inranag was obliged to vault over the side or risk being incinerated. His bellow of surprise and rage brought the heads of all his guards, all the priests still harassing the Viran round in shock. The giants in his guard drew their swords and faced about in every direction, searching for a foe. The grey-cloaked priests did likewise, though gazing about with more than keen eyesight. Lund came to himself. The hold of the priests dissolved instantly like a severed rope. Strength returned to his arm. An enemy, sword raised high, was about to strike. There was no time to parry the blow effectively, but he managed to interfere with the aim, so that the sword went wide of its intended course, cleaving the soil next to a kneeling form in front of him. Lund nearly stumbled over the boy, whom he had not noticed before. It was one of his scouts. The enemy had recovered, and leveled the blade at him in a sideways sweep while he was off balance. This blow he could parry well, returning the other's weapon to the side and reaching inside it simultaneously. With one of Rune's arena maneuvers, he skewered the larger warrior before he had regained his balance. He placed a hand on the shoulder of the still kneeling figure.
All right then.
It was Brennick, trembling as he rose to his feet, but now with a slight smile on his pale face. Gareth watched with relish as the platform went up in smoke. He had mastered the intimidating fear the mere presence of the hooded man inspired. The figures below were scurrying about, dark, oversized shapes for the guard, gray, loose robes for the priests. They were all looking about, searching. Quickly, he squatted down behind the rail, and turning his back to the platform, slid down to the floor. Pressure started in his mind, the harbinger of pain and frantic fear. Had they found him so soon? In vain he searched for an image of the stone in the portal veil. The fury of the Marsh Lord beat about him like a gale, tearing at his sanity, his resolve, his consciousness.
Fear not the darkness.
Pain exploded in his head, but he resisted now, fiercely, unwilling to surrender without a struggle. The face of the shadow, snarling, contorted with rage, invaded his mind till he saw nothing else. The pressure increased unbearably. He was gasping, a strange taste in his mouth. Suddenly, it abated, then ceased altogether. He sat staring, reaching for every breath, his head clasped between his hands. Things seemed out of joint in his body, inside his head. Tentatively, he reached out his fingers to feel whether his teeth were loose. At the same time, he became aware that something was happening outside. He turned, and his gaze was instantly drawn to the sky. The shadows of the 6 Loctii passed over the flaming platform. Malik was tempted to dispatch one of them to deal with a nuisance in the watchtower, but there were more important matters at hand. He turned his attention to the winged figure hanging in the sky, his blade bathed in the blood of dragons. This was the real threat, the real reason for all the theatricals and parading of force on this field. This day he had forced Vaer out into the open. This day he would break him and finally have his revenge.
Look, there are more of them coming.
The urgent call from Hunnick lifted Rune's gaze to the dark sky above the marshland host. Half a dozen fire breathers were straining in their direction in an irresistible line of armored might. How were they to deal with so many? He hesitated, pointing to the Aeronite right wing they had left behind. Wayne's men are faltering. They will break if attacked again.
They are breaking already. Vaer will have to aid them, or the flank will be turned. They have no more defense against the flyers.
Anik lowered his blade as if to corroborate this.
What are we to do?
Rune stared up at the approaching formation in desperation. Oddly, there seemed to be a huge fire where the platform of the Shadow Lord used to be. Then he saw the figure waiting for the winged beasts. They're not after us. Look up there, Anik gasped.
He's facing them alone. Not even Vaer's bow could reach that far.
Rune nodded. If he cannot stop them, the day's lost. The leading dragon was bigger than the rest, a slimy marshland green in color, with overlapping scales of a darker shade covering it from head to claw. As the formation closed in on their prey, it rose a little higher than its fellows, and slowed somewhat to let them pass on ahead. The two creatures on the flanks strained ahead to circle round and attack from the rear. A new leader, reddish-black like the molten rock of the mountains in the hand, came head-on, already drawing in the air for its bellow of fire. This one he targeted first. Vaer folded the stirring wings that had held him aloft, and dropped like a stone through the forming hoop of malice. Moments later he spread them wide again, and swerved away to his right, using the speed he had gained to outrun the fiery billows following his swift maneuver. Now he strained forward, ever increasing the space, and banked to the left and up, clipping the extended wing of the red leader in passing. The beast made an ineffectual grab with its left claw, far too late to make contact. It had slowed considerably to do so, momentarily leaving the formation. Vaer turned swiftly in a tight circle, coming up behind it. Clumsy because of the injured wing, the beast was unable to evade his attack, or even turn in time to meet it. The scorching blade struck between its shoulders, penetrating into the spine. It rolled over, making a feeble attempt to lash out with its tail, but there was no response from the senseless broken body. The Seer saw the beast fall away to the ground below and worked his way higher amid the furious cries of its fellows. Despite their rage, there was more caution on the side of the Loctii now. They did not hurry forward individually anymore and reduced the pace of their approach. He could see their intention. There was no way to avoid it. Vaer swerved away again towards the left flank of the semicircle, but they followed his movement, turning to keep him in the center. Fire flowed from every maw, lighting up the sky and surrounding clouds in a golden blaze. Vaer spoke a word, and the air responded, swirling about him in a hissing purple haze, at odds with the dragon fire sweeping over him from every side. Through the inferno he plummeted, straight for one of the beasts in the middle of the group. The blinding fire made him miscalculate, however, and he hardly had time to strike at its exposed throat before hurtling past. Too late he saw the large green one descend to block his escape. A heavy claw slammed into his body, throwing him off balance and drawing a raking line down his side. Though it failed to penetrate the armor, the blow momentarily confused and winded him. There was no time to recover. Already the others closed in on him, eager now that his superior speed had been impaired. The green giant remained above, preventing any escape in that direction, while the rest worked their way around him. He knew they were trying to force him downwards, to obstruct any quick maneuver on his part. If they could succeed in hemming him in, he would be trapped and become easy prey. Again the fire rushed out to blind him, to convince him there was only one way out, downwards, ever lower, away from the threat above and on all sides. Yet for a moment the monsters also obscured their own vision, and he disappeared from sight in the fiery haze. Vaer used the opportunity to attack, bursting through the wall of flame to emerge in front of a spiked, jet-black beast, completely taken by surprise. He charged in swiftly, giving it no chance to recover. There was sufficient power left in the blade to pass through the creature's throat, still open mouthed, and out the back of its skull. He almost lost his grip on the hilt as he vaulted over the falling carcass, rolling to the right to avoid a vicious attack from the next dragon. Only the swiftly disintegrating frame of his victim prevented the weapon from being inextricably lodged within it, and thus effectively disarming him. Two creatures followed close behind him, while the large one remained above, and another kept to his right in line with the Belruth wall. Below them, the lines of men strove against each other, all foreigners fighting over Viron soil. The right wing of the Aran host had stabilized to a degree with the help of the Imrathians, but they were still falling back before the relentless onslaught. The entire force seemed to pivot round Evrain's men in the center, with Raelf almost up to the King's Gate. Vaer swerved to close in on the isolated beast on his flank, but it saw him coming and turned away, heading out over the city. He gritted his teeth in frustration and strained his wings to catch up to it, the relentless pace greatly adding to his growing fatigue. The pulsing beat of dragon wings passed close to the watchtower and its single occupant. Gareth watched with bated breath as the huge beasts followed close behind the winged figure of the Seer. Could he really deal with all of them? Already 2 of the newcomers had been struck from the sky. Only 4 remained. Since the 13 Loptii had made their appearance, he had seen all 5 attacking the Aran host fall, 4 at the hand of the Seer. Now 2 of the remaining 8 had succumbed, leaving the 4 currently engaged in the epic struggle with Vaer, and 2 more he could not account for. These had to be devastating the Gilrith hosts still. White fire arced down from the clouds as the winged man struck another of the abominations a death blow. The heavy bolt smashed into the roof of the king's palace, dragging dozens of the red-brown tiles clattering into the courtyard after it. The Seer swerved again, heading for the clouds, significantly slower now. The pursuers were on top of him, and he seemed unable to shake them off. Cold fingers closed up the staring boy's throat. His fears became dread certainty. The struggling figures broke through the grey shroud above the wall, heading back out over the field of battle. Vaer was obviously hard-pressed, worn out with a tremendous contest. No longer was an advantage of speed. The longer these creatures could keep him aloft, the greater their chances of overcoming him completely. He made an attempt to close with one of the pursuers, clumsy and predictable. Yet the monster allowed it, its fellow seizing the opportunity to strike from behind. Raking claws brought streaks of blue fire from the chrysolite armor. For an instant all 3 bodies seemed to be in contact, Vaer wedged between the 2 dragons. Then one fell away, inanimate, lifeless. The other had a hold on the Seer's left arm and reached out with its massive jaws. Gareth cried out a meaningless warning, the bow impotent between his cramping fingers. Frantically he searched for the arrows, scattered on the floor during the attack from the Shadow and his priests. Surely the abominations were within range now. Vaer thanked the Keeper of all Destinies for the wild conditions in the air that day. He hardly had to search for the flow of potential, but rather simply attempt to control the channeling of it through his blade. They were dangerously close to the ground now, the beast ignoring the loss of altitude in its eagerness to destroy him. He glimpsed the open jaw reaching the huge incisors about to close on him. Warm breath washed over him. With all the strength that remained to him, he shoved the blade into the beast's throat, then retrieved it and thrust it into the armored chest. He tried to push away from the carcass with his knees, but the death grip on his arm did not relent. There was no opportunity even to brace himself for the impact with the ground. Above him, the green beast stooped to fall on the helpless prey. There appeared to be a lull in the fighting on the left flank. Raelf was reluctant to push forward, and the enemy facing him held back warily, content for the moment to watch. Rune glanced over to the center where Ranald sent his last reserves to bolster the failing right wing. Then he looked aloft, where the lone champion strove against the abominations from Tiralan. At that instant another one tumbled from the sky. At first he was jubilant at the sight, but something touched his thoughts. A cry of despair and pain, anguished.
Gareth,
He is fallen. Vaer is down.
how?
Dragged down to the beast he has slain. There's another above.
Rune strained his eyes. A large form descended swiftly in the wake of the stricken beast. Would Vaer survive the fall? Someone had to aid him, or the beast would surely... He looked about him across the enemy lines. Was it possible to break through them and reach the scene on time? The carcass had fallen quite close to the wall, perhaps 200 yards behind the milling marshland forces. He knew at once that it was not possible. Was he merely to watch then, and save his strength for the possibility of confronting the Shadow Lord? He had already disregarded that instruction. Gareth aimed carefully, the chrysolite tip of the arrow pointing at the monster dropping from the sky. This was the moment, he thought, the reason Peric had given this precious gift. Even if he could not slay the beast, there would be one blow struck in the defense of the Seer. Vaer was dazed, stumbling about to find his blade. There was blood on his brow. He was only vaguely aware of the peril he was in. Remembering that there remained a potent enemy close by, he still had no inkling of its whereabouts. The arrow streaked away, a glowing light at its tip. He felt for it like a spark of hope, a small light in the crypts among the damned and suffering. It found the mark, penetrating through scaled armor and tough hide, lodging itself deep in the throat of the beast. A choked braying bellow of pain and surprise erupted from the great maw, while the body swerved slightly off course. Vaer's head jerked skywards. He stumbled to one side to avoid the grasping claws, lost his footing and dropped to his knees. In front of his bowed head lay the shimmering blade. Gareth fitted another of his precious arrows in the bow. Only 2 remained now. He would have to make them count. The beast below raised up its massive paw to crush the kneeling form. Why did Vaer not get up to defend himself? Was he that badly hurt? Gareth released the arrow, watched it speed away to its mark, willed it forward with all his resolve, all his art. The beast was struck in the chest, pausing in its attack, and lifted its head in his direction, the fury spilling from its fiery eyes. It was a fatal hesitation. Vaer moved with what speed he could still muster, and buried the blade deep inside the monster's chest. The tempest of flame erupted about him, but he ignored the beast's death rattle, retrieving his weapon. Swiftly, he sliced through the neck, severing the head completely. He stumbled backwards, almost falling, then steadied himself by leaning on the blade. For the watcher in the tower, a miracle had occurred, but his relief at the sight of the still-breathing champion was premature. Other eyes had followed the contest. Other hearts were dismayed as much as his rejoiced. Malek of Teralan uttered a cry of rage and fury at the sight of his last Lochti's fall. Already he had sensed the destruction of the 2 ravaging the force from Gilreth in the east. The anger and hatred boiled over inside him. He surrendered at last to its scalding embrace. The great shadow stood up from the forest, tall as the walls of Belruth itself, amidst a cloud of swirling dust. 3 of the guards and several great looks who stood too close were drawn into the shaping. Whole trees were torn and ravaged in a maelstrom of violent transmutation. The screaming soil and splintering wood were swallowed in the deafening birth roar as Horan Inranag, the form of Nightmare, finally appeared from the smoking nebula. A mortal dread stole over all living things, giving the struggling warriors at both ends of the field pause. The 2 closest to their master backed away in fearful awe. Ranald and his captains stood staring, their urgent orders forgotten in mid-sentence. The last chrysolite arrow dropped from Gareth's trembling fingers. Brun felt the blade in his hand grow heavy as the strength seeped from his arm. This, then, was the power of the Marsh King. Lond's Viron band broke and ran, the fear of the crypts pursuing them, and he did not attempt to stop them, but followed close behind, fending off attacks from the tour. There was hardly any need, though, for the Dark Warriors let them go unmolested, while the great fear took hold of them also. Only one figure held his ground. In the center of the field, his body mired and bloody, stood the Seer. Gareth's gaze fixed on him, drawn irresistibly, while he realized this was a hellish dream unfolding before his waking eyes. Cold fingers closed about his throat, and he dropped the bow to pull vainly at the collar of his shirt. Vaer's blade was lifted heavenward, and the dull surface sparked into glimmering life once more. Yet the armor had faded to mere wisps of color, and Gareth knew he was at the end of his strength. Tears started in his eyes, but he could not look away. The massive black beast launched itself forward, bearing down on the solitary figure defying it. The blade swung in a tight arc, casting its final bolt into the approaching storm. If it hurt the monster, there was no sign, but Gareth knew by the cry of anguish emanating from its heart that Vaer had poured all that remained to him into the strike, and that he was dead before the massive talons speared his body and shoved him aside, limp and broken at last. He did not see the jubilation or hear the roar of triumph that followed this victory, for the snowy hillside in the pass lifted itself before him, bringing with it the stricken visage of someone who had seen his own demise in the appearing of another, while the last words spoken still echoed in his mind.
Farewell, Gareth.
In the steel-grey sky above, he imagined a fleeting glimpse of wings disappearing into the haze.